Hello, and welcome to the latest iteration of Chatbox, my little kind of impromptu off-the-cuff series of videos where I kind of just talk about whatever I want to talk about that day. I've been doing these kind of as an adjunct to my videos on my regular channel, which if you haven't seen my regular channel, go look at that. There are links down in the description, and I'll probably put one up in one of these corners right now. But I didn't do a video that was a companion to my last video, which is because that video itself was kind of an impromptu off-the-cuff thing where I just kind of took you on a tour of my AV system and home theater system and stereo system. And I thought now, since I didn't do a companion video before, maybe I'll talk about some things that I've done post that video, meaning after that video, to my AV system, as well as maybe answer a few comments and then talk about a few other things that have been on my mind that don't really fit into the main channel. I've got my thoughts on the Switch 2 announcement. I've got some other gaming stuff. I know I haven't talked about a lot of that recently. I've been kind of focused on the audio video, but you know, I'll talk a little about it now, I guess. But anyway, let's get started. All right, so first, in that last video that I did where I walked through my AV and stereo systems, I talked about my Pinnacle PM5 speakers up here in the office and how they were great speakers when I bought them. They had kind of degraded, and I was a little disappointed in that and didn't really know what to do. Someone in my comments suggested that I recap the crossover. I had never even... that was not a thing that I knew about, to be honest. I knew crossovers existed. Obviously, there has to be some way for the speaker to separate the signal going from the subwoofer, or not the subwoofer, the woofer to the tweeter. And, you know, these are simple, I'm pointing over here because that's where they are, but these are simple two-way speakers, a 5 1/4 inch woofer, and I don't know, like a 2.5 inch tweeter, something like that. Very simple crossover in there. I thought, hey, you know, there's one capacitor. I'll just order some capacitors. I could replace them all in 5 minutes and then just see what happens. So that's what I did. Both my sets of speakers, I have two sets of Pinnacle PM5s. They have slightly different, I mean, like a different brand of caps in both sets. I think I bought them a few years apart and they had made a few little changes. Same values, but just different brand. They look a little different. And they're 3.5 microfarad capacitors, 50 volts. And that, and non-polarized, obviously. That's basically an impossible spec. I don't, it doesn't seem like those are even made anymore in that spec. So I went out, I got the closest thing I could on short notice. I just wanted to try it, kind of proof of concept, and then if it worked, maybe I'll think about getting something better. But so I went out, I got some 3.3 microfarad, 50 volt non-polarized capacitors. They look quite a bit different. They're quite a bit smaller. You know, the tolerance is not as good. They're probably not as good capacitors as what was originally in there. These TI capacitors that were in one set, they actually say on the capacitor plus or minus 5%. That's pretty tight tolerance, and there's not much out there like that at this point. Probably some audio specific high-end capacitors, I don't know, but I just got some general purpose 3.3 microfarad plus or minus 20% and 50 volt non-polarized capacitors. Stuck them in there. It was a little annoying getting the old ones out. There was a lot of hot glue involved, and it's not pretty how it ended up looking, but you know, got it done, got them put back together, hooked them up, listened, and I was blown away. My God, it made a huge difference. To me, they sound brand new again. As far as I remember, and you know, it's been a long time since they've been brand new, so you know, maybe they sound better than they did. And they all sound matched now. They all sound exactly the same, which that's kind of how I know that it actually worked. It did something. It's not just subjective. because before they all sounded different, and I kind of had to go through and pick out the two best ones that I had to make the system that I currently have. Now it doesn't matter. They're all the same, which is how it should be. So yeah, thanks again, whoever recommended that. And if you're having a similar problem with old speakers like I'm having, where they just degraded, they kind of got muddy sounding over time, try this yourself. It's so easy, and it definitely, I feel like, made a big difference for my speakers. Now, I tested the capacitors that I took out, and I'll show some of that footage right now. These are supposed to be 3.5 microfarad capacitors, and the older set that I bought with those big TI orange capacitors, plus or minus 5%, remember, they measured something like 6.2 and 6.4 microfarads for each of them. I may have that number wrong. I'll be showing what it really is now, but it's something like that. So they're about 80% out of spec. And when the capacitor rises like that, the voltage also decreases. So they can't handle the same amount of voltage either. And from what I understand, and I've been reading a lot about this now, I didn't know much about it before, but from what I understand, as capacitor rises, all else being equal in a speaker, that means the crossover itself is going to drop. So the frequency of the crossover drops, which means the tweeter now is getting sent frequencies that it potentially can't handle. And that is potentially why they started sounding muddy and actually like my tweeters were blown. That's kind of what I thought, at least about a couple of them. So now they're back to being clear and bright, and they sound great, and that's because the crossover is back to at least close to where it should be. Now, I measured the capacitance on the new capacitors as well. I actually forgot to do that before I put the ones in that I put in, but I got 10 of them because there was like a 50% discount if you did that. And I measured the remaining ones, and they all measured, even though it's a 3.3 on the new capacitors, they all measured like 3.6, 3.7. So still not quite bang on the 3.5 that were originally supposed to be in there, I guess, but better than it was, definitely. And now that I know that this works, I can replace these like 50-cent capacitors with like a much better audio oriented capacitor at some point that, you know, is really going to last a long time and hopefully give me kind of bang on what it's supposed to be. But these are great speakers. I mean, like, for a lot of people, it might not be worth it for like a set of $100 speakers, but these really sound great. I mean, there's a review of these on the internet. If you Google them, I'll post a screenshot to it now. I can't remember the actual URL, but they measured them, and they measured the same thing that other people have measured, which is that there's a little bit of a hole in the mid-range, and there's kind of overemphasized bass and treble. But they said at the end, but these test results, you know, subjectively, these speakers sound much better than their test results, and even almost as good as their reference speakers that cost 20 times as much. So that's kind of been my experience with them as well. They sound great. And to me, it is worth recapping them. And maybe it would be to you as well if you have some old speakers like this. Now, speaking of that, and this video is not going to be all about speakers, but there are some things that I want to talk about from my last video as well. I want to talk a little about speaker placement and speaker choice. And that kind of is the same thing. It's a subjective thing, right? So in that video, I showed my Q Acoustics 3030i speakers that I have downstairs in my living room. And they're good speakers, and they've been reviewed well everywhere. I don't know of anyone that has bad things to say about them. And I don't either. I said in that video, they're not really what I want a speaker to sound like, I guess. They are very mid-rangey. They don't have a lot of bass or high end. They're not as clear sounding as my PN5 Pluses. And I got some grief in the comments saying, you know, well, bring them out into the room, get them away from the walls and it'll open up the sound. So a few things with that. First of all, they are ported speakers. Now, ported speakers need the reflections of a wall behind them in order to maximize their bass response. That's how they're designed. They're designed to be at least somewhat near a wall. If they're not going to get their rated bass response. Let me just clarify this because that was not clear. They need to be a certain distance from the wall for optimal bass response. And that can change depending on the room and even depending on the person. There's no one set distance from the wall that these speakers need to be. You just need to experiment, and I've done that. But it's definitely not the case with rear-ported speakers that you want them as far away from the wall as possible. You want them at the right distance to give you the right amount of bass. If they're too close to a wall, they will get overly aggressive or boomy sounding bass. That's not my problem with the Q Acoustic speakers. My problem is there's not enough bass response. So theoretically, I could move them closer to the wall and get better bass response. I'm not doing that because, first of all, in one case on the right side, or I'm sorry, on the left side, I'm thinking looking behind. On the left side of my system, I have the one speaker almost against a parallel wall. And that's another thing people were talking about in my comments. There's a parallel wall, and then that wall kind of angles out. And I've pulled the speaker far enough so that the sound wave is going to go out, and it's going to kind of follow that diagonal wall. It's not going to bounce off the parallel wall. The parallel wall is not there anymore where that speaker actually is. If I had pushed it back far enough that I'm getting the full benefit of the porting from the back, then yes, it would be bouncing around on the parallel wall. So that's why I've pulled it forward there. It's also about 5 inches away from that wall, which should be enough for a speaker that size. But again, it's got plenty of room for the sound waves to go outward. So again, not the problem. That's not the problem. The problem is just I don't prefer the sound of those speakers. And that is, speaker choice is a completely subjective thing. We have speakers that are objectively perfect or close to perfect. And anybody can buy those speakers. They're called studio monitors. And that's what music is mixed and mastered on. They have a completely flat frequency response, or as close to flat as possible. And when I was talking about my home theater setup, I talked about how I had used Dirac Live to correct for my room and make those speakers basically flat in terms of frequency response. If you do have a flat frequency response, and again, this is subjective, but it's going to sound like there's not enough bass. So I do have my bass cranked a little bit higher on my home theater system, but for the most part, it's a pretty flat frequency response. You can get that for music too, and you can then hear music exactly how they hear it in the studio and exactly how the band and the engineer is intending for it to be heard. So why don't we do that? Why don't we just buy studio speakers? We all could. They're out there. They're not even that expensive. Well, because we all have our subjective tastes. It's kind of funny to me that audiophiles and just audio enthusiasts, and I do this too, we kind of focus on specs, we focus on build, we focus on accuracy, we focus on components that, we call it hi-fi, which means high fidelity. I've talked about this before, the fidelity of trying to match what a live sound would be as we hear it in recorded music. But then we buy these speakers that are objectively terrible. Like they don't have a flat frequency response. They don't reproduce music the way it was recorded. They give us a sound that we like. And that's all it is. And given that, any speaker could be good or bad. It doesn't matter. It's totally based on who is listening to it. And we all can then have preferences for the type of sound profile that we want from our speakers. I personally just am not the biggest fan of the sound profile that I get from the Q Acoustics 3030Is. I really like the sound profile that I get from my Pinnacle PM5 Pluses. And I know I'm not alone in that. But again, like, we have to stop kind of pretending that we're all going for accuracy in our music reproduction. We are not. We are going for accuracy to the point that the output actually is converted to something that we can hear. And at that point, we are all just basing our personal preferences on completely subjective criteria. And that's fine, but we should just admit that that's what we're doing. I feel like I have some self-awareness about that, or I wouldn't be making this video, but I kind of wish other people would have the same self-awareness. All right, now I'll switch over to talking about video games, I guess, here for a minute, which is another subject I talk about sometimes on my main channel. But I mentioned in my last video during my home theater walkthrough that the original Switch is really the only one of the modern home consoles that I actually play a lot. Nintendo is the last remaining proper game company. Sony and Microsoft, came to it from somewhere else, but and they're doing their own thing. Nintendo is still a very focused game company. They just make games. They do their own first party stuff. Their first party stuff is why people buy their systems, and that's the way it used to be. And I totally respect that. And they have a house style, and that kind of encourages other developers to develop in a similar style. And so their systems, it might not always be to my taste. I'm not like the biggest Mario fan or whatever, but I respect what they're doing. And it does result in kind of I think a higher quality overall on their systems, and there do end up seeming to be more games from other developers that I like, even if there are fewer games overall, although that's not necessarily true in this generation. But the games that come out even from third-party developers, it seems like they hold themselves to a higher standard because they're trying to compete with Nintendo, whereas on Sony and Microsoft platforms, there's nobody really setting the standard. It's just do whatever the heck you want. And that just has led to just so much shovelware and just crap. So the Switch, yeah, I played a lot of the Switch. I still do. And I'm excited about the Switch too. I probably will buy one the day that it comes out. Now, it is just an iteration, and it's kind of surprising to see that from Nintendo, or really actually from anybody at this point. It's I think the name is appropriate. It's a Switch 2. It's not a new system. It's not like a Switch Advanced. It's not it's not like a Super Switch. It's like, well, I guess you could call it a Super Switch, but when you think back to the Super Nintendo was completely different from the original NES. So it would invoke that probably, and it's not that. It's literally just an iteration on the Switch, but that's probably a good thing. The Switch was already a good thing, so it's just faster, which it needed to be. It needed an update. It's bigger, which I can go back and forth on that, but I mean, a bigger screen is not a bad deal. And for home use, it's fine. And I mean, it has a couple new features, like the little mouse thing that you can do with the controllers. I don't know if people are really going to use that, but I guess it would make certain types of games easier, especially PC style click fests, if you can use the controllers like a mouse. So yeah, I'm almost definitely going to get one a day of release, especially if it's $3.99 as rumored. By the time I put this video out, it might be announced with the price, but if it's $4.49 or $4.99, then I may have to hold off a bit. I don't know, but if it's $3.99, it's probably almost guaranteed a day one purchase from me. So yeah, definitely excited about that. Now, I mentioned in that last video and just now, actually, that I haven't been playing modern systems that much other than the Switch, but I have been playing PC games a lot. And that's kind of what I've crossed over into. I mean, I go back and forth over the years. It's always been that way since the 80s. Consoles, PCs, I just switch whatever's more compelling at the moment. But I've been doing a lot of PC gaming recently, and nothing that's too earth-shattering. I don't really have anything to tell you that you wouldn't already know about, but I've been finally getting into Cyberpunk 2077. Picked that up during one of the Steam sales recently. I think it's now definitely to the point where it's a stable, kind of well-rounded, polished, mostly polished game, at least as polished as any like Grand Theft Auto, which is kind of what it is, really. It's Grand Theft Auto with some Starfield or Fallout tacked onto it for the most part. But yeah, Cyberpunk 2077, and then every, I own the first Madden game ever made, which was for the Apple II. Here's a picture of it. I still have my original copy, and I had it for Genesis. I make no apologies for being a sports game fan. I pick up a new Madden every, 4 or 5 years. That's about that's about the point where they've changed enough of it for it to be new and different and something I can get into again. So I've been playing a lot of Madden 25. I think the last one that I bought was like Madden 19 or whatever. And I've got like 130 hours into it now. I'm on my 4th season in my franchise mode, playing every single game, all 60 minutes, and setting all kinds of records, trying to bring back the New York Giants defense to their glory days of the 1980s, and having lots of fun with that. I've been exploring my Steam library, which I'm guilty. I'm one of those people that buys tons of games during the Steam sales and just lets them sit there, and eventually, hopefully, gets to some of them. But yeah, I still have a lot that I need to get through. And I'm still technically playing Final Fantasy VII Rebirth on PS5, which I really need to get finished. It's been hard for me to get into that. Remake was great. I didn't want it to be all in Midgar, but for what it was really great. And Rebirth, it's just, they stick you out into the open area. I don't remember what the name of it is, and like if I'm away from it for like 2 days, I forget what I'm doing, and then it's really hard to get back into it. So I haven't been able to get into it like I did with Remake, but I do need to get back to it. Now, the only other gaming thing I think I've been doing, I did get one of the Atari 7800 Plus units for Christmas. So I now have the 2600 Plus, 7800 Plus. They're great systems. I honestly have not yet hooked up my 7800 Plus. I have it out, but I know enough about it to know how I feel about it. And I love these things. The 7800 Plus is basically just like the 2600 Plus, but it has wireless controller that comes with it, and it's the European 7800 controller. It's a great controller. System itself is just, it's just cute as a button. Just look at this picture. Next to the 2600, it's even smaller than the 2600, and I love these systems because they feel like real systems. And they are real systems. They play actual cartridges, but everything about them, like nothing feels cheap. They feel like a real 7800, just shrunk down, but not shrunk down too much. I feel like a lot of the mini systems, like it's obvious that they're just using some system on a chip in there, and they don't feel like real systems. It's just like it's like a Raspberry Pi with a custom shell. These systems from Atari, they feel like real Atari systems, and I love that. I think what Atari's doing these days is like they've found their mojo again. I mean, it's not the same Atari, obviously. It's still Infogrames. It's a French company. I mean, they have headquarters now in the United States. But, Atari was bought and sold a million times in the past too. Like, the Atari that released the Jaguar is not the same as the Atari that released the original VCS. Even the Atari that released the 7800 wasn't the same Atari. Nolan Bushnell didn't own Atari past, what was it, like 78, 79? It's been a while since we had the original Atari, so I don't care anymore. It's just a name until you start doing something with that name that's actually meaningful, right? And I think that what the current Atari is doing is probably what the original Atari would have been doing if they were still around. They're taking good advantage of their past intellectual property, and they're doing really cool things with it. Like, it's not just these little plus consoles. I mean, that's what it is now. It's a line. It's called the Plus line. You've got the 400 plus, the 7800 plus, 2600 plus. There's going to be others, and these are, actually, is it the 400 plus? Maybe it's the 400 mini. But in any case, it's a plus line. Like, they have settled on that. They're going to make more stuff in that line. And that's kind of their almost main Atari line now. And then they've got the co-branded stuff. They're doing like the Game Station Pro and stuff like that. The portable, and they've got a tabletop arcade, and like they've got tons of stuff for all different types of players. I mean, if you want just an emulation machine, you can get that too. I guess they're all emulation machines, but if you just want to play ROMs and not physical cartridges, like, there are many, many options now, official options for Atari systems, and they're taking the care that they should to make these things. They're not just shovelware. All right, and lastly, I always close out these videos with kind of a show and tell. And this week, I'm going to change it up just a little bit. Not much, but a little bit. I want to talk about David Lynch for a minute. David Lynch is somebody who literally changed my life. And you may think I'm being hyperbolic about that, but I'm not. If you don't know who he is, you should. But if you don't, he was a director of surrealist films and TV shows. Twin Peaks was a TV show. He also did On the Air, which was a TV show, and a ridiculously underrated one. Go and find the episodes that do exist of On the Air. I think there are only like 3. And it is one of the funniest shows I've ever seen. I was laughing so hard I was crying the first time I saw the first episode. But it was canceled very quickly. The first exposure that I had to David Lynch was when I was about 8 years old. And it was The Elephant Man, which, as far as I remember, was his second film. Eraserhead was his first major film, his first full-length film. That started off apparently as a student project. He finished it after he graduated or whatever. I can't remember. Did he even graduate? I don't remember. And then he was hired to do The Elephant Man, as far as I remember, shortly after that. And The Elephant Man was probably his most normal film. And it's kind of a forgotten film now. I remember it being talked about, and maybe it was nominated, but it was definitely an Oscar consideration for Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Director, all that. I think it probably did win for 1 or 2 things, but then from there, I was like 8 years old. Like, I saw that on HBO. I was blown away, and I kind of started following him from there. Then there was Blue Velvet, which I saw in high school, like literally in high school. I think my high school had like an assembly where we watched Blue Velvet for some reason. And then Wild at Heart. Wild at Heart is not my favorite. I I'm forgetting some, like not all of his films were my favorite, but and then Twin Peaks came.
Hello! I was wondering if I might trouble you for a cup of strong black coffee, and in the process engage you with an anecdote of no small amusement.
And Twin Peaks, I still think is, I mean, and he thought was kind of his masterpiece. And
Good Lord, Laura.
started out well, obviously, and then kind of went off the rails a little bit. And, you know, there's a whole video there talking about why that happened. But second season ended on like a severe cliffhanger, and then it was canceled. But then came Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, which was the film showing, it was kind of the prequel up to the events that happened in the TV series. And it showed what actually happened to Laura Palmer. And I was blown away by that. I remember it getting kind of mixed reviews. And I see some of the reasons why. I mean, it's very different from the show. It's very dark. And it's surrealist, and it's weird, and there's lots of dream sequences and other things in there, and it's weirder than the show ever was. And if you only knew Twin Peaks from the show and then you watch this film, it would be like, whoa, like what is happening? But I always thought it was severely underrated. Ended up writing an essay about it to include in my application to NYU Film School, and I got in because of that. So, and then every job that I had after graduating from NYU, I got because I went to NYU Film School. Like the people who hired me actually told me that. So, yes, David Lynch literally changed my life, and he's still one of my favorite directors. The stuff he did after Twin Peaks, obviously Mulholland Drive.
I can't believe it. I'm just so excited to be here. I'm in this dream place.
Mulholland Drive, I think, is still his best standalone film. And Naomi Watts in that should have won an Oscar. I still say she should have won an Oscar. But at least she got famous based on that movie. I mean, the actors that he surrounded himself with made him better, and they all made each other better, and they were all amazing actors. So, I mean, you got to talk about them too. Kyle MacLachlan, Laura Dern, obviously. I mean, these are people he basically discovered. Naomi Watts. Cheryl Lee, I got to meet a while back with my wife. Cheryl Lee and the guy who played Bobby Briggs in Twin Peaks, Dana, I forget his full name. I'm sorry. I'll put it on the screen now. But we met him and her, and that was totally amazing. All just great actors. And yeah, I have a large collection of David Lynch stuff. So that's my kind of show and tell thing. Here's hopefully a picture of it. And I have on my wall behind the camera here, you can't see it, I have the Italian theatrical poster for Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, and I can't show it on YouTube because it's a red band poster. I mean, they don't call it that in Italy, but it's not something I can show on YouTube. It's a still from the movie, and if you know the movie at all, Cheryl Lee is not clothed in a lot of it. So anyway, yeah, David Lynch, just kind of a little eulogy to him from me, I guess. He died this week, if you're watching this in the future. And yeah, I'll miss him. I mean, I'll miss his films and his vision of how things are. And by the way, you probably saw in the image that I just posted in my collection, I do have the Twin Peaks from Z to A box set. Definitely, if you haven't seen it, watch Twin Peaks season 3. There are people that still don't know that this exists. He resolved the story of Twin Peaks in season 3, and yes, there are all new questions now and stuff, but I think basically the story of Twin Peaks season 3 is that you can't go back. And that's what he was trying to say. Like, you can't, and that's why he wanted to make it. You can't go back. You can't recreate something that was there before. You can try and you can get close, but in the end, something is not going to be right. And that's kind of what that whole season was saying, I think. By the way, I forgot to mention, I've actually done the Twin Peaks tour. Twin Peaks is an interesting show in that the town of Twin Peaks does not exist, but the location of Twin Peaks basically does. It takes place over two towns, Snoqualmie and I think it's South Bend up in Washington, and a few locations over near Seattle. But you can go visit. Many of those locations still look exactly the same as they did in the show. A few have changed, but it's a great place to visit, and it really does feel like it does in the show. I'm really glad I did it. Anyway, yeah, that's pretty much it. But, and that's pretty much it for this video. So, like, subscribe. I don't know what else to say. I guess I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye.